Welcome to this pictorial history of the ancient city of Ephesus, located near the modern city of Selçuk, Turkey, in the Izmir province. As you look at the photographs that I've taken on my recent trip, you'll immediately notice that Ephesus was located in a fairly mountainous area, and this is not unique to this city alone. The other 6 cities I visited of John's 7 cities in the book of Revelation are all similarly situated in mountainous areas such as this that makes me appreciate the vigor of the apostles Paul, John, and others who traveled these areas taking the gospel of Jesus Christ to these various cities. After we've taken another minute or so to look at some of the terrain around Ephesus, I'm going to start showing photographs of individual buildings and construction in the ancient city of Ephesus. The photos are going to kind of come fast and furious, but let not your heart be troubled, because I'm going to do a separate video log where I will be talking about individual buildings and architecture, things like that, in the city of Ephesus. This is going to kind of be limited to a historical overview. I will also do a separate video log that addresses the religious history in the area of Ephesus to supplement the information I already gave in my Come Follow Me podcast from November 5, 2023. Let's begin by talking about the archaeology in the area of Ephesus. This city is one of the best preserved and largest ancient sites in Asia Minor. Approximately 15% of the city has been excavated, which means that 85% of it is still under the soil. The archaeological research at Ephesus stretches back to 1863, so excavations have been going on for almost 150 years. It's one of the largest Roman archaeological sites in the eastern Mediterranean, and if you kind of do the math that it's taken 150 years to get 15% of the city excavated, that means we need another 850 years or 1,000 years total to complete all of the excavations and archaeological work that needs to be done at Ephesus. I was pleased to see during my visit that there were actually people working at the site. You see them here in their vests, probably pretty much how they dressed back in the Roman days as well. But having visited all of the 7 cities, this was the only one where I actually saw active archaeological work going on at the site. One of the pictures was of particular interest to me because I'm a kind of a Bob the Builder kind of guy, but if you look at the column on the right, you'll notice it doesn't have any outer face of marble or limestone like the column next to it, and so you can see that this is under construction, where they've built a concrete column and then they will cover that with the exterior marble or limestone that they find at the site. I just thought it was pretty interesting, so I took a look at that. The archaeologists have actually been intrigued by the Ephesus site because there's no definite location for the ancient settlements, and there have been numerous sites that have been excavated suggesting a movement of the settlement at various times. Our tour guide indicated that there have been at least 3 major sites for the city of Ephesus, and then 2 other minor movements of the city have been made as well. And as I run through the history here a little bit, I'll talk about those movements as we go along. The chronological history of the founding of this city has different versions as to when the history of Ephesus actually began. There were some excavations done at the Basilica of St. John in 1954. Some of the pottery that they discovered suggested that the area was inhabited as early as 1750 BC in the Bronze Age up to potentially 1050 BC. Some items that they found in a burial ground caused them to refine the estimates somewhat to determine that they think it was initially founded sometime between 1500 and 1400 BC, but that's still kind of a moving target. So there are several myths about the founding of Ephesus. One was that there was this mythical founder who was a prince of Athens named Androclos. And he founded Ephesus as he was going on a walkabout or something. He was looking for a site to settle, and the Oracle of Delphi told him a fish and a boar will show you the way. Now, I've been to the city of Delphi, and we're going to talk about that in another video podcast that I'll be doing on that one. But at any rate, the legend is that after the oracle had told him that a fish and a boar would show him the way, he was out hunting in the area of Ephesus. He shot a boar. It kind of ran off, but eventually died at the place where he then founded Ephesus. And so he was the successful warrior king who then joined the 12 cities of Ionia, which is essentially the area of Asia Minor, and his image is depicted on the Hadrian Temple that we'll be looking at in more detail in the next video log that I do. So another legend was that Ephesus was founded by the women warrior tribe called the Amazons. So obviously if the city was founded back in 1500 to 1400 BC, this was well before the time that Wonder Woman was born, and so she didn't live until the First World War, as you know. But at any rate, concerning the name Ephesus, it's thought to have been derived from the word Ephesus, which means the city of the mother goddess. And the mother goddess in this context refers to the Greek goddess Artemis. And we'll be talking a lot about the Temple of Artemis, which is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It doesn't exist anymore. But at any rate, so to begin our discussion, whatever the time period was when the village was actually first founded, it was started by a Greek tribe, or the Amazons, those warrior tribe of females. And the history gets somewhat interesting by the time we get down to about 650 BC, when Ephesus was destroyed by this nomadic tribe from the area of the Caspian Sea. And in their wake, Ephesus was ruled by this series of tyrants, and the people eventually revolted, and Ephesus was then ruled by a council, and the city prospered. So some of the building that you're going to see in the city was the government agora, where this ruling council was set up, not necessarily way back when in 650 BC, but certainly during the Roman time, when they had some type of a council that was active in the city. Now by 560 BC, Ephesus was conquered by the Lydians under a king by the name of Croesus. And these Lydians essentially were kind of the indigenous people in the Anatolia area of what is now modern Turkey. And he was kind of a harsh ruler, but he was also the main contributor to the reconstruction of the Temple of Artemis. That would have been kind of the precursor to the big temple that gets finished later on. And we know this because his signature is found as an inscription on the base of a column that is now located in the British Museum. And there's a lot of stuff in the British Museum because this area and many other ancient areas were part of the British Empire for a long time, and so a lot of artifacts have been taken to the British Museum. I think that's probably a place you want to spend a week or so if you really want to see some of the ancient wonders of the world. Everywhere we go, the guides are always telling us, oh, this is in the British Museum, oh, that's in the British Museum, this is taken somewhere else by this guy, and it's like, okay, well, when I go to the British Museum, I'll let them know that you want it back. So at any rate, the Lydians under Croesus invaded what was essentially a Persian area, and when the indigenous Greek people who were there, the Ionians, refused a peace offer from Cyrus the Great, they sided with the Lydians instead, but eventually the Persians conquered the Lydians, and the Ionians at that time then wanted to make peace with Cyrus the Great, but he wouldn't go for it, and he insisted that they essentially surrender and become part of the Persian Empire, and that all happens around 547 BC. But eventually Babylon, just to put this in context, fell to Cyrus in about 536 BC. So before Cyrus and the Persians ever conquered the Babylonian kingdom under Nebuchadnezzar and his successor, they first defeated the Lydians in an earlier time period. So the Persians, essentially, when they kind of took over, incorporated the ancient Greek cities in Asia Minor, or the Ionians or the Lydians, as part of their empire, and then ruled them by provincial governors called satraps. And Ephesus more or less prospered under Persian rule, but eventually they participated in what is known as the Ionian Revolt, or the Battle of Ephesus, in 498 BC. And this came about because the Ionians were sick and tired of paying high taxes to the Persian tyrants that were ruling. And if you kind of go back and take a look at Daniel chapter 7, where he has his vision of these successive kingdoms, he describes the Persian Empire as this bear who is grinding nations between its teeth, and in its teeth it has these three ribs, and one of them is thought to be the Lydian kingdom, which the Persians ultimately defeated. And that's the area that we're now talking about. So take a look at Dan 7 and go back and read that. That'll give you a little bit of a context. But essentially the Greek troops, who were the Ionians, were defeated in a rout at Ephesus. And so as we move forward in the timeline, if you go down to about 479 BC, the Ionians were eventually successful with some assistance from Athens in ousting the Persians from Asia Minor. And then that takes us down to about 430 BC, when the Peloponnesian War began between the Greek cities of Athens and Sparta. And this war drug on until the Persians then came back into the scene on the side of the Spartans and defeated Athens. And at that point in time, the rule over the cities of Ionia, or Asia Minor, was ceded again to Persia. Now, these wars didn't greatly affect daily life in Ephesus. They were part of the Persian Empire, but were generally fairly modern and forward-thinking in their social relationships. They allowed strangers to integrate, and education was valued. And so life wasn't too horrible under Persian rule. By about 356 BC, this temple of Artemis was burned down, and according to a legend, that was done by some lunatic by the name of Herostratus. And after he burned down the temple, the Ephesians began to restore the temple in kind of a modest form. But they had these big, large, grand plans for building what would eventually become one of the seven wonders of the world. And then come in from stage right, we have in 334 BC Alexander the Great, who defeats the Persian forces. And to a certain extent, this was almost like a liberation for these ancient Greek cities from Asia Minor, because of course Alexander was Greek himself, and so he was greeted warmly when he entered Ephesus in triumph. And when he got there, he saw that the temple of Artemis wasn't yet finished and was still incomplete, and so he proposed to finance it and then have his name inscribed on the front of the temple. And this was kind of, well, that's a little bit of a dilemma for the Ephesians, because here's the guy that just conquered them, and he wants to give them money for the temple, and it's kind of like the golden rule, you know, whoever has the gold makes the rules. But they didn't want his name on the temple of Artemis, kind of taking over. And so they had to use a little bit of Ephesian diplomacy, and so they told him, listen, it's not fitting for one god to build a temple to another god. And so Alexander's sitting there thinking to himself, well, you know, that kind of makes sense, or words to that effect. And so he decided, okay, I'll give you the money, but I won't make you name it after me. And so it remained the Temple of Artemis. And with the assistance of Alexander, this became one of the largest, if not the largest building in ancient Asia Minor, and as I mentioned, one of the seven wonders of the world. Now, in 323 BC, Alexander died unexpectedly. Some people think it would have been from malaria, others from typhoid fever, or quite possibly by poisoning, because he apparently fell ill after drinking wine at a banquet in Babylon. He had a high fever subsequently for several days, and then he died, and so more than your usual hangover, obviously. And at the time of his death, Alexander's empire was then divided among his four generals. And this is where you can go back to Daniel chapter 7 again and look at the imagery used by Daniel to describe the Greek Empire, because it's described as this leopard. That is, after the Persian bear, you get this leopard, and he has four heads, and those four heads are essentially these four generals that took over Alexander's kingdom when he died. Well, the guy, or the general who took control of Asia Minor, is a guy by the name of Lysimachus, and so he took over in roughly about 306 BC and continued to rule until he was assassinated in 281. Now, during his tenure as the king in this area, they were having problems with the river there that was silting up the old harbor there in Ephesus. And by the time he was ruling, and by the time of his death, the river Castor had silted up the harbor so much that it basically had kind of turned into a marsh that was causing malaria. And this, despite the fact in their best efforts to dredge the harbor regularly so that the problem would exist. But needless to say, Mother Nature had her way, and the marshes brought mosquitoes, the mosquitoes brought malaria, and the malaria brought many deaths among the inhabitants. And so Lysimachus made the decision that he was going to force the people to move from Ephesus, located fairly close proximity to the Temple of Artemis. Now, it's important to note here that the Ephesus that Lysimachus took over is not the original Ephesus. There was one before this, back in the ancient times, and it had gotten moved to this location in close proximity to the harbor area and to the Temple of Artemis that they were building. But because of his concern about the sickness, and also because of its close proximity to a large fault that was causing earthquakes in the area. So he decided, I'm going to build a new Ephesus, what will become Ephesus number 3. And so he began construction of a new fortification wall that was about 9 kilometers in circumference. But of course, the people living in Ephesus number 2 didn't really want to move. And so Lysimachus, as a last resort, blocked the sewers, and these Greeks and the Romans after them were masters of design and architectural innovations and structural engineers and all this stuff, but they had this underground plumbing, and so he plugged up the sewers, and it started to back up until the people finally said, okay, if you're going to make a stink about it. Or they said something like that, I'm sure. And so they finally moved to what would become the new site of the city, which is I refer to as Ephesus number 3. And it's about 1.2 miles away from the location of Ephesus number 2. And essentially what he did was he took the ancient city Ephesus number 2 in the marshy area and put it on the other side of the mountain, which is known today as Ayasaluk. And so they moved from the side that this earthquake fault line was on, just on the other side of the mountain, about 1.2 miles. And so, you know, he didn't know much about earthquakes, but because he should have known that if you just move 1.2 miles, not going to make that much difference if that's the fault right there on the other side of the mountain. But essentially on one side of this mountain, you have the fault, and on the other side you have the amphitheater that you'll be seeing in the photographs that you're seeing as I'm talking along here. So that's kind of how that came about. Now, Lysimachus then named the new city, so nobody confuses themselves about Ephesus. He called it Arsinoe, which was the name of his second wife from Egypt. And so this wall that he built to cover the new city enclosed about 1,030 acres. People place the population estimates at somewhere between 50,000 and 138,000. Others say that I think that's a little too high, and lower it down to as little as 33,000 to 56,000. So at any rate, as I mentioned, in about 281 BC, Lysimachus was killed by one of his counterpart generals by the name of Seleucus. He was his rival general, and so when Seleucus takes over, the city was renamed Ephesus again. I'm not going to keep the name of your wife from the guy you just killed. So Ephesus number 3 is the current location of the ruins that you're seeing in the photographs today, and Ephesus remained part of the Seleucid Empire, more or less, until the time of the Roman Empire was coming in from stage left. And in 190 BC is when the last of the Seleucid kings, Antiochus III the Great, was defeated by Rome. And at that time, Ephesus then came under the rule of an Attalid king of Pergamum by the name of Eumenes II. Now, Pergamum is one of the 7 cities that received a letter from John in the book of Revelation, and they took control of the area because they were allies of Rome at the time that they conquered the Greek Empire, and so they made this area a Roman province, and because of the assistance of Pergamum, Ephesus was then kind of given a favored tax-exempt status and autonomy within the Attalid kingdom, and they continued to reign until 133 BC. And at that time, the grandson of Eumenes II, a guy by the name of Attalus III, died, and he didn't have any heir, and so he wrote a will and he left his kingdom to the Roman Empire. Now, there was a will contest, of course. The things that change, the more they remain the same, right? And so there was a will contest, but eventually it was ironed out, and the Roman Empire took control of the Asia Minor in about 129 AD, and at the time that they took control, the residents of Ephesus immediately felt their influence because the taxes rose considerably, and many of the treasures of the city were systematically plundered by the Romans as they kind of brought in their own culture and architecture, which can still be seen in the ruins today. Now, if we continue to move forward to about 89 to 85 BC, we have what's called the First Mithridatic War between Rome and the Kingdom of Pontus, which is a northern Anatolia tribe in the modern country of Turkey. And there was this general by the name of Archelaus who saw things going badly for the Mithridates, and so he convinced the king to open peace negotiations with Rome, which they kind of eventually entered into an agreement. And so the Greeks basically welcomed in Archelaus as kind of a savior and a peacemaker, and the first thing he did was he ordered that all of the Roman citizens be slaughtered throughout Asia in one night, and 80,000 people were killed, including people, if you just simply spoke with a Latin accent, you were going to be executed. And all of the statues and monuments of Roman citizens in Ephesus were destroyed, and the so-called more or less Greek people that remained were given a measure of substantial rights and freedoms, and Ephesus became for a short time kind of self-governing. But the Romans kind of licked their wounds, and in 86 BC they came back and defeated King Mithridates, and They because of the Greek people that were still in the city, they kind of made them pay the price for all the bad things that Archelaus had done, and they imposed on them 5 years of back taxes, and it left the city of Ephesus and other Asian cities heavily in debt for a long time. Now, in other tabloid news, in 33 BC, Mark Antony visited Ephesus at the time that he was a proconsul over Syria, and he honeymooned for the winter with his wife Cleopatra of Egypt. That's why this is tabloid news. But at any rate, by 27 BC, Augustus had become the Roman Empire. So all these civil wars between Antony and Caesar and all the other, and the killing and assassination of Julius Caesar, blah, blah, blah. We finally come down to 27 BC when Augustus becomes the Roman Empire. This is the same Augustus who taxed the Jews in Judea at the time that the Savior was born. So Augustus made Ephesus the capital of proconsular Asia instead of Pergamum. And so it then became the largest city of the largest province of the Roman Empire, and probably also the wealthiest of all of the cities in Asia Minor, because it was both the seat of the government and a major center of commerce, with a lot of trade going on between Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean in general. So by this point in time, Ephesus was second in importance and size to only Rome itself. And so some people put the population of Ephesus at 225,000 people, but more recently scholars are suggesting that these estimates seem unrealistically high. They just think that because Ephesus is in kind of this mountainous area, and given the coastline and other things, it would really make it impossible for it to have achieved that kind of number. Now, the place that they kind of come up with the 225,000 is this Roman practice of building amphitheaters that would accommodate 10% of the population in the city, and this particular city had an amphitheater that you've seen that had a capacity for about 25,000 people. It was the largest in Asia Minor. So that's where they kind of come up with these things. Anyway, by the 2nd century AD, so after the time that John lived there and was banished to Ephesus, that I will separately discuss in another video log, after Paul is executed and all of those things have happened, by the 2nd century, starting at 100 AD and going forward, Ephesus kind of reached the zenith of its economy, development, and culture. And by the early in the 3rd century or 200 AD, you start to see the economic decline that occurs from a series of earthquakes. In 263 AD, the city and temple of Artemis was destroyed by the Goths, which is a Germanic tribe. The city was eventually rebuilt, but this was kind of a dramatic turning point in the city's splendor. By the 4th century, we have Constantine the Great coming in, rebuilding the city. He erected new public baths, and as we approach the end of the 4th century in 391 AD, Theodosius I, who was then the Roman emperor, outlawed pagan religions. And so many of the temples in Ephesus and in other places were converted into Christian churches, and new churches were erected, including the Basilica of St. John that I will separately discuss in another video log. By the 5th century AD, Ephesus had recovered and had again become kind of the most important city in Asia Minor within the Byzantine Empire after Constantinople. And the Basilica of John was built during the reign of Justinian I in the 6th century. It was also a city that was an important commercial center, but it really was starting to see its decline by the 6th century, and we're now talking about a decline from which there would be no recovery. And this was the result of essentially 3 factors that I've kind of already alluded to: the silting up of the harbor that brought marshes and malaria. Just to give you an example, when that harbor existed, Ephesus number 2, was right on the coastline of the Aegean Sea, and now Ephesus number 2, at least the remains of it, are about 5 kilometers inland from the sea, despite the repeated dredging. So you can just see just how bad that turned out to be. The other reasons for the decline were the sanctions that came about because the Ephesians had left their first love, as predicted by John in the book of Revelation. They were kind of a free-spirited people, religiously speaking, not committed to Christianity, even in the 6th century. And so Justinian, the emperor, wrote a nasty letter. He's trying to get rid of paganism. He writes a nasty letter saying, hey, you need to be committed to Christianity. And he said, I'll come and get you if you don't commit. And their reply was this kind of, well, we're really kind of a free-spirited kind of people, and we don't get what the big deal is. And so Justinian then issued economic sanctions against the city and essentially cut the economic ties between Rome and Ephesus, and that proved to be kind of a death knell to the city because it was the capital city in Asia. He just cut it off from Rome. So the third thing, of course, was the earthquakes that I've alluded to. There were a number of them in the middle of the 4th century, and even with the help of imperial donations and tax exemptions to try and help to rebuild the cities, it just never really did recover. And so you see so many of the ruins that exist in the city in large part to people who have invaded and defaced and destroyed, but Mother Nature had a big hand in bringing about the condition of the city as it exists today. In 655, for example, the Arabs came in and sacked the city, hastening its decline and trying to get rid of Christianity and bringing in the religion of Islam. And so by 890, Ephesus had also lost its political and military supremacy to the city of Smyrna, another one of the 7 cities. In 1090 AD, the Turks conquered Ephesus. By that time, it was really just a small village that existed, and they had control for about 7 years when the Byzantine Christians resumed control and changed the name to Hagios Theologos, but that didn't last forever. So in 1304 AD, Ephesus finally surrendered to a Turkish warlord who controlled the region for several years, and contrary to the terms of their surrender to the Turks, they pillaged the Basilica of St. John. Most of the local population was deported to Greece, and many of the remaining inhabitants were massacred. So that's how things went under the Turkish rule in Ephesus, although there was a short period of prosperity in the 14th century. But by that time, the city was really kind of a scattered group of settlements rather than a homogeneous city. When the Crusaders of the Fourth Crusade came through in 1308, they came through and were surprised to see that, hey, what happened to the city? All we see is this kind of small village. They kind of expected to see this bustling city with a large seaport, and it was gone, and the Temple of Artemis was completely forgotten. So by 1390, the Ephesians were incorporated as a vassal into the Ottoman Empire, where they remained, of course, until the First World War, when the Ottoman Empire was kind of split up and eventually becomes most of it modern Turkey. And by the 15th century, the ancient city of Ephesus was pretty much completely abandoned, and we had to wait until the 1800s for the archaeological activities to begin, and the city then comes to life again, not with a population of resident inhabitants by tourists. So I'm one of them, and so that's kind of a history as we've looked at some of the ruins. And I thank you for listening, watching, subscribing, and sharing, and look forward to being with you again for another adventure in the ancient city of Ephesus.